Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Sellgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Today I would like to talk about state pensions around the country. That's the plan that state governments have to pay out retirement benefits to public employees like teachers or other public workers. That's the moment where most of my listeners, especially the younger ones, will think, boring. Big mistake. There's currently a public pension crisis, and it's about to explode in our faces. And when it does, it won't just affect government employees, but it will affect all of us because we are likely to be the ones paying for it, regardless of whether it happens in our state or not. So listen up. Today, it is my pleasure on January 14th, 2022, to speak to Josh Rauh. He is the Ormond Family Professor of Finance at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Juliette. Great to be here.
So before we jump into this issue, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Always a great question to start your interviews off with, Juliette. That's terrific. Well, I would say you should never conclude whether a statement or view that somebody makes or expresses is true or false based on who said it. You should only evaluate it on its own merits. Because if you do think about who said it, then it's not only going to lead to a tribalism that's bad for our society, but it's also going to lead you to make false inferences. Now, you might say, duh, I know that. But this is about putting it in practice. So, I don't know, can I say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course.
Well, when I think back on the time when I was in college at Yale, almost all my friends were self-identified liberal Democrats. And I was at the time pretty apolitical. I was interested in economics as a discipline and was aware that economics could be applied to thinking about public policy. But I wasn't particularly partisan. And on social issues, I would say I was relatively libertarian, but I also valued tradition in many ways. These were some values that I think I developed having attended a certain high school in the Boston area. But what I observed, and especially what I observed thinking back on that time, is that my friends and acquaintances, and to some extent I myself, actually, at least before I had gotten very far in my study of economics, we generally let our gut instincts about social issues define points of view on things that we knew a lot less about, like economic policy. And so in particular, I think I and people I knew in college especially greatly trusted candidates or politicians who resonated with them on social issues, and then they would trust what they would say about economic policy. And I think that's a big mistake, and it leads to a certain sort of single-minded type of thinking. At that time, this was the dark ages for you, I guess. It's the 1990s. Things were not nearly as polarized as they are today in our country, but there still was a tendency to say, well, this party speaks to my views on one set of issues. Therefore, I'm going to let it tell me about all issues. So I would say probably when I was in college, the social issues people were probably most passionate about were abortion, gay rights, and so people would often therefore assume that the party that spoke to them on those issues was going to be right in telling them about economics, and that isn't necessarily the case. And so I think the most important thing that people who are graduating high school today, entering college today, should realize is that there's no one person or one party or one politician who's got it all right, who's got it all wrong. You have to approach everything with an open mind and look at the facts on every individual issue, and not give in to the polarization and tribalism.
That's a great response. I especially think about how myself, there's no way I'm right about every single thing, and everyone else is a human just like me. And so there's no way everyone is right about everything. There's no way one person is right about every single. I mean, there might be a chance, but it's very low, especially considering how many of us there are on the planet.
Indeed, it's very low, and so if you conclude that just because someone is speaking to you on one set of issues that they must be right on another set of issues, even if you're slightly inclined or sort of biased to believe them on other issues that maybe you don't know that much about, you can go down some pretty wrong paths of thinking, and of course it also happens in the opposite direction too, which is that there are very few people out there who are in public life, who make it into public life, who are actually wrong on every single issue. I mean, you might disagree with somebody on a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that everything they say is going to be wrong or every idea they come up with is going to be wrong. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
That's another good point. So let's jump in. We'll get into exactly what a public pension is shortly for those who don't know, which I was kind of confused on it myself to an extent before going into this. But first, I want to ask you how much it's costing us right now as taxpayers. Is it by state, as a country? How does that work?
You really want to get into the nitty gritty of this right away. I can tell, and I'm ready to go there. Believe me. I mean, I can talk about this stuff for hours. A lot of people often ask me how I even got interested in studying such a topic, and so if it's okay with you, maybe I'll say a couple things about that first, because it's a pretty esoteric topic, and it's not that many people just kind of end up going down a life path where they study this.
Yes, please. I actually was wondering that earlier, but now that you've brought it up, 100%.
That's the question that many people are wondering but are afraid to ask. So I might as well talk a little bit about that. And so I think actually I'll take it back to a story about how I got kind of started in economic policy and graduate school in general. I was talking a little bit before about my life when I was in college, and I'll say back then I was an economics major. I wasn't really super focused on going to graduate school or pursuing further study in economics. I wasn't really super focused on working in the finance industry either, which is what a lot of economics majors I went to college with were interested in doing. I guess maybe the reality is that I guess I just wasn't very focused at all. After college, I didn't sort of go down the traditional kind of investment banking route that a lot of my friends or people I knew in college were doing. I took a year doing some paid internships and some unpaid but free studying in Europe, and ultimately I ended up actually working sort of in a finance position, definitely for a financial firm, an investment bank in London, doing sort of economic policy kinds of things. And I hadn't really found my niche. I was interested in finance and financial markets, but I wasn't that practically oriented. And I also found issues of economic policy, government, taxes, spending, very, very interesting, and a really just constant topic of debate and discussion among folks, both in Europe and the U.S. At this time. Believe it or not, Google was new. This was a revelation that you could find anything, any article you wanted to on the internet. It's shocking, I know, but and so for work, I had dug up some articles about macroeconomics because I was kind of working on macroeconomic policy in a working paper series put out by a great organization called the National Bureau of Economic Research. But I started browsing some other NBER papers, and I got interested in the work of a professor. His name is Jim Peterba, who ultimately later became my advisor and my mentor. And he studied topics like topics really that are about state government finance. This gets to the pensions a little bit. Actually, what he worked on was the question of state budgets, like balanced budget rules. And what does that mean? So, we got 50 states. Each state runs a budget. They've got, they raise taxes, they spend the money on certain things. And unlike the federal government, states put rules on themselves. They have sort of self-imposed rules that they're going to run a balanced budget, meaning that they're going to roughly, spend as much money any given year, any given time period as they take in taxes. Now, if you follow the federal government and what they do, they don't even pretend to do that, right? So, I mean, we see the federal government, running up trillions of dollars of deficits, annually, trillions of dollars of deficits at this point. So they don't pretend to have a balanced budget rule or impose a balanced budget rule on themselves, but states do. And so, the interest in pensions kind of goes back to actually initially finding the work of this professor, who ultimately actually became somebody who had a very big impact on my career. Reading an article by him that asked the question as to whether this really works. I mean, you can think about it, right? I can tell myself, I promise myself that today I'm not going to spend more on going out for dinner and drinks than I made today at my job. I can make a promise like that to myself, but there are all kinds of mechanisms and ways that I could potentially maybe get around that. Credit cards, all kinds of things. And so essentially that's the question that he and others have been asking for a long time about states, and ultimately concluded that to some extent these kind of balanced budget rules, these rules you impose on yourself, work for states, but in other ways not. Although at that point I think they hadn't really identified what are really the ways that that states actually kind of get around these balanced budget rules. So. Long story short, I actually applied to. He was a professor at MIT, so I applied to go to grad school at MIT. I'll tell a little bit of a personal story, just because I get the sense for your podcast that you like to mix the sort of personal stories with the nitty gritty. Is that
yes.
true? Okay, yes. We're going to get into the nitty gritty in just a minute if people are still with me. So, and once you start doing that with me, there's no going back. So I try to front load the sort of personal stuff. But anyway, because I wanted to work with this professor, I applied to the PhD program in economics at MIT. I got in there, but not with a very good funding situation. And then right before I was supposed to go and visit for the kind of admitted PhD student day, I found out that the professor I really wanted to work with was going on leave to, of all places, Stanford University's Hoover Institution, which I had heard was a beautiful place and wonderful place to be, and later in my life discovered ex post that was true, and that's where I am now. And the also story was that this wonderful professor I wanted to work with might not be coming back. Oh
man,
yeah, I mean it was rough, and then it got even worse because I went to the admit day, and he was working on he was on leave, or he was out here in California visiting, and so I went to the admit day, and he wasn't there, and then one of the other professors, the person who was responsible for the grad program there, I had a meeting with him. He said, please don't come here. We admitted too many students this year, and I hope you won't come. So I was somewhat shocked, and also much later in my career, I discovered that apparently this used to happen quite a bit, actually. And through exchanging this story with others, and actually my openness about the story, I tell it quite a bit now. I ran into a few other people in my profession, actually people who I really think of as better economists than I am, who said, that's exactly what happened to me too. What each of us actually, yes and no. What each of us independently did, though, was, not knowing that anyone else was facing this, was made the decision to say, no, this is my goal, this is my interest, and I'm going to do this anyway. And that's what I did. And fortunately, while things were a little bumpy at the beginning, Jim Peturba came back from Stanford, from the Hoover Institution, decided not to stay there, came back to MIT. I started working with him and had the opportunity to work with him, and he was a really terrific mentor for me and has been for my whole career. So it worked out well. But I guess two lessons from that. Number one is, of course, well, stick to your goals. Once you've formed a goal, if you really want to go after it, don't get discouraged by one or two people's negative comments. And secondly, share your failures with other people, because often it brings a lot of insights and strength.
Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, it means so much that you shared the story, but also I'm very glad it turned out well. And two very good points to draw from that. So thank you.
No problem. So I'll now happy to go back to your question about where we are now on pensions. I'm not even sure I really actually wrapped up the question of how I started working on the pension. I think I got to the point of explaining that it's related to these state governments. Are they when they say we're going to run a balanced budget, are they really doing it? And so through a number of years of work, I started looking at that topic, and there was a time, though, kind of in the mid 2000s. When I was starting to work on this, where it was kind of a boom time back then. The economy was really good. This is before what you've heard of as being the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and before any great financial crisis, there's usually like a great big run up and boom. And that's what we had going on back then at the time. And so I was studying these state government pension plans, which are these programs where if you work for the state government or for a local government, or if you're a teacher in a school district, or a public safety official, police, fire, and so on, you get a special benefit for working in these jobs, and that is that when you retire, you get a check from the state or local government that you worked for. It's your pension. It's different from the retirement plan that most of you are going to experience, most of your listeners are going to experience, which is like a 401k plan. 401k plan is where you're going to go work for a company, and the company will say, Juliette, if you contribute 5% of your pay to an account, we will also contribute 5% to that account in a kind of tax preferred way, and that money you then, Juliette, will be able to manage that money. You have an account at a brokerage. You can invest it in stocks and bonds or whatever you like, and then the plan, you try to plan so that when you're ready to retire, you have enough money in the account to retire. That's how you're going to manage your retirement. But that's not how public employees manage their retirement. For them, it's more that the state or local government is basically going to take care of them by sending them a check when they retire. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Thinking back to all the things I'd studied in grad school about balanced budget requirements and things like that, and states saying we're running a balanced budget. I thought, this seems like a situation where you could really get yourself into some hot financial water, because if I were a state and I were employing people, and I said, when you retire, I'm going to send you a check, and that check, if you work here for a long time, that check might be as much as you were making before you retire. I could imagine getting to a situation where if I were the legislature or the governor, I was the person saying the rules, I could get into some pretty hot water, because how am I going to make sure that I have enough money sitting around to be able to pay that retirement benefit when the time comes around? Or like a school district, right? I mean, if I don't have the money sitting around to pay retired teachers what I promised them, then how am I going to actually pay the teachers who have to be teaching at that time?
Yeah.
So that, to me, I said, all right, so there really could be an issue here. And so, I started looking at it with a colleague in another kind of resilience story, because it was such a boom time and things were going so well for the economy. I had a lot of colleagues tell me, states are fine. Nobody, and besides, these are pensions. Nobody really cares about this stuff. You just work on something more interesting, literally. Okay, so and I said, well, I actually think that states are not fine. So this was before the financial crisis. I said, based on my calculations, states are $2 trillion in debt to these pensions, and some
this was before 2008.
Before 2008, right? And states
Wow.
themselves were saying they had no debts, no problem. States were saying, look, we have balanced budget rules. We've been following them. Essentially they said, oh well, we don't know what you're talking about. We have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, okay, well, hold on. Well, let's look at where this comes from. And what I discovered was going on was that states were using a very, very crafty budget sort of trick, all right, kind of accounting trick, to make it seem like the promises that they had made to public employees were really not that burdensome, and that they would have money to pay for them, even though they wouldn't have the money to pay for them. And what they were doing was they were making assumptions that every dollar that they would sort of commit to plan or prepare for the future retirement of their employees would grow at a rate of 8% per year. It would earn returns at a rate of 8% per year if they just kind of invested it well. So what that meant was every dollar that they contributed today would be worth $2 in 10 years for sure. Would be worth, because it doubles roughly, it means it's going to double roughly every 10 years, 9 years, would be worth, $4 in 20 years and be worth $8 in 30 years. So I like to do a little thought experiment to understand the trick. Are you up for a little thought experiment with me here? It's a little bit,
yes,
a few numbers. Okay, all right. So, let's suppose that you found someone who was willing to lend you today $100,000. Not bad, right? And that they were because interest rates are really low. Let's just assume that the interest rate on this loan is 0. We could do it with like 1% or 2%, 5%, whatever. But let's just assume that they just tell you, just all you got to do is pay me back in 10 years. Maybe it's like a friends and family kind of thing. All right. So now let's suppose you took this $100,000 and you say, all right, I'm going to do something with this. I am going to take $50,000 of it, and I am going to spend that on a vacation. This is going to be a really great vacation, and I'm going to spend this money. I'm going to live large until 50,000 runs out. And then I'm going to come back. I'm going to come home, and I'm going to take the other 50,000 and I'm going to save that 50,000. In fact, I'm going to invest it in the stock market. Okay, this sounds like you should be thinking this sounds like a little bit of a risky strategy if you're with me, right?
Well, so it depends on how long you're holding that before you have to pay it back, right?
Right. Well, that's right. That's one big question is how long you're going to, so let's say they gave you 10 years. You got 10 years to pay it back.
It's not that much time.
It's not that much time. And the market can go up and the market can go down. And so it's a risky strategy. And what state and local governments do is they assume that you're going to get the returns that you need for sure, that 50,000 is going to double in 10 years. That's what a 7.5% expected return means, is you're assuming your money is going to double in 10 years. So there are kind of two questions. One is this kind of a good strategy or a good approach? I mean, I think, to me, right, it sounds kind of risky. It might work out. It might not work out. But the other question has to do with how you portray your finances to someone else. So, and this is where the research actually really comes in. So suppose after you've done this, you took the vacation, you decided to invest the rest of the money. Like a year or two later, you wanted to buy a house, and you wanted to take out a loan to buy a house, a mortgage, and you went to the bank. And the bank said, okay, well, here's a form. This is very standard. I want you to write down all of your existing other debts that you have out there. Well, it would be, in the private sector, if you had this arrangement going, you would have to write down that you owed somebody $100,000 in 10 years or 8 years, or however many years were left. You have to write that down. It would be fraud. It would actually be fraud and illegal if you did not write it down. You can also write down that you have $50,000 of stock of assets in the stock market, that might make the bank look a little more favorably on your loan. But you got to write it down. You can't not write it down. What do state and local governments do? What state and local governments do is they will pretend that there's no debt there at all in that circumstance, because they assume that the money that's in the account is with certainty going to grow to be equal to the amount that they borrowed. And in the public pension example, borrowing means you promised the teacher or the chief of police that they're going to get a pension of $100,000 a year when they retire. So it's about not telling the public what's actually going on. And that's why, before the financial crisis, even, we were finding that there were $2 trillion of debts that were not being disclosed by governments, because the governments were assuming that the money was just going to be made up by the stock market. And you know what? Maybe it would be, maybe it wouldn't be. And looking now, maybe it wouldn't be. But it's risky. And they're basically, they're going to the casino here on it without telling anybody about it. And that's, to me, is the real policy issue.
Seems kind of skeevy, if I have to give it an adjective. That just seems like it would be so illegal. Like, if I could get thrown in jail for it, how come the government can just do that? I don't know. Well,
that's a great question. And it's because there are different sets of accounting rules that the government sets for itself. So with my students at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, they spend a lot of time with their accounting professors learning about financial accounting standards for private businesses, because they're going to be running private businesses or working in private businesses, so they need to understand those. They spend less or no time on governmental accounting standards, and the government, through what's called the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which sets the rules, they basically set the rules so that they are allowed to do that, whereas the financial sector, the private sector, is not allowed to do that. And so that's a problem, right? When they're regulating themselves by setting rules to themselves that allow them to conceal, to hide these unfunded liabilities, then they're not. What I think they're doing is not presenting a picture of financial reality. Now it's interesting, because when I bring this up, the comment I get from them a lot is, yeah, but you're recommending a kind of accounting that's inconsistent with governmental accounting standards. They think they're insulting me by saying that. I say, yes, thank you very much. That's correct, because the governmental accounting is wrong, is incorrect, and is actually worse than incorrect. It's constructed in a way that actually helps you hide the fact that you've got debts. It allows you to circumvent the balanced budget requirements that you set for yourself.
And when you talk about the government accounting standards, you're talking about the fact that they can just assume that their returns on investments will come back exactly as planned and all of that, right?
Exactly.
So how often do the investments actually return as they're predicted to?
Well, this is a great question, and goes to some lessons that I do with my students every year at the business school. The stock market over the last 100 years has done remarkably well. So the U.S. stock market has done remarkably well. It has returned around 12% per year in annualized returns. And so, it used to be that what pension funds would do is they'd invest about 60% of their money in stocks and about 40% in bonds, which are safer, relatively safer. And that would be the justification for their assumption that they're going to get an 8% return, because the bonds might return a lot less. Stocks might return 12%, they would hope. And then, on average, you're going to get to this 8%. But the trouble is that, we've only experienced one history in the U.S. And, the question is, why does the stock market keep going up? Some people view the stock market going up as just a gift that's just going to keep on giving. But that is not the view that I would say 98% of kind of finance trained and finance academics hold. The view about the stock market, what it is it's a compensation for risk. And what that means is that it might keep going up, but it might go down. and it might go down by a lot. And the only reason that one might hope that it's going to go up is because you're taking on risk that bad things might not happen. To take a really extreme example, there were a couple of countries whose stock markets were on a tear in the early part of the 20th century. That were then totally destroyed and leveled by wars. I mean, their value of their capital stock went to zero. And so, now those are very, very extreme events. Fortunately, they didn't happen in the U.S. But there are all kinds of events that don't have to be as extreme as that could happen and that pose very, very big risks for financial markets. So it's a tricky question to ask, right? Based on history, and history is the justification, by the way, that the people who defend governmental accounting, they say, look, this is history. The stock market has gone up by 12% per year. I'm a finance professor. You don't have to tell me that. I know that's true. That's history. But the market goes up in expectation only because it's a compensation for risk. And it doesn't mean that those risks might not happen. And another thing that I want to mention is something you said before is, well, what if we just wait long enough? If we wait long enough, will it come back? There's not really much evidence out there that can really speak to the idea that the stock market is safer in the long run than in the short run. Most of the evidence shows that if you only have like a 1 or 2 year horizon, stock market is very risky. But once you start looking at like a medium to long term horizon, it's really not clear whether it's going to be safer, riskier over say 20 years versus over say 50 years. Very, very, very hard to say that.
So when do the pensions start? And so how long is the horizon? What does it look like? When are they investing this money and when do they need it back?
Super question. So it's kind of an ongoing thing, meaning that, we've got people, many public employees right now who are retired. We also have many, many public employees who are going to retire in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years and 30 years and 50 years. And so what we like to do to try to measure what is the sort of rough time horizon is to look at what's called the duration of the promise. It's like the average time period over which we're paying out the money. And the average time period over which we're paying out the money is around 11 years. So meaning that we should be investing thinking more of like a 10 to 15 year horizon than like a 50 to 100 year horizon, because there's a lot of liabilities, a lot of payments that are being made right now, and they have to be made in 5 years, 10 years, and so on. So there's kind of a mismatch between the way that pension funds in the U.S. invest and the way that one should think about it.
So I know with COVID, there was a lot of talk about like, oh, this is a big problem. This is a big problem. But why is now the time when we're in this public pension crisis? Is it getting worse and worse? I mean, if before 2008, there was $2 trillion of debt and they keep covering it up, nothing about anything of their behavior or government really makes me think that they would fix that on their own. So what state is this issue at now?
Yep. So interesting what has happened. So the financial crisis happened and the stock market went down by a lot. And that's when people started saying about the work that we were doing, well, maybe these guys are onto something, because even states then had to admit that they were underwater. And we said, well, okay, now our $2 trillion though has now become $4 trillion, because there's a ton of losses in the asset markets, and also because interest rates went down, it became a lot more expensive to be able to provide pensions to people. Over the 10 years since the financial crisis, what's fascinating is that the stock market has actually done really well. When we first did our calculations, which was right before the financial crisis, the S&P 500, which is one of the main indices of the stock market, was at around 2,000. Today, it's at around 4,600. So over that period, they will have. I mean, they maybe even did a little better than their 8% expected return over that time period. But the number, though, and since we started doing our calculations, finally, much later, a few years ago, the federal government, through the Federal Reserve, actually finally started doing some calculations to correct, not so much state by state, but to sort of get an aggregate correct number that now looks a lot more like our number. So now the number is still around 4 trillion. Actually, I think the latest number from the Federal Reserve is 3.8 trillion. So even after a period where the stock market did pretty well, the problem didn't get better. And I guess that's because what that goes to show you is that, yeah, I mean, they basically met their expected returns over these 10 years. But in order for the problem to get better, they have to exceed the expected return. And also, in order for the problem not to get worse, they're going to have to pull that trick again. So the question is, do we really think now, looking forward another 10 years, is the S&P going to be at 9,500? In 10 years time? I mean, that's a pretty big gamble to be making. If it's not, then that 4 trillion is going to get worse and worse and worse. So I think the answer to your question is, things were looking pretty bad at the time about 10 years ago. They still look bad. The stock market has done so well that it's been able to forestall a major crisis where cities or states are just unable to meet their obligations. But unless the stock market keeps cranking out these types of returns, if we just have a few years where it doesn't, then we're in deep trouble.
So some states are more likely to face a serious crisis than others because depending on what state it is, they're all in different sorts of shape. So they're all bad, but some of them are worse than others. Which ones are the most likely to face serious issues in the next few years?
Well, the state that's been in the greatest trouble for a long time is Illinois. And in particular, I should note that some of these pension programs and systems are organized at the state level, and some of them are organized at the city level. And Chicago, the city of Chicago, is in very, very big financial trouble due to pensions as well. And in a state like Illinois, where Chicago is about half the economic activity of the state, it almost becomes hard to sort of separate these things because there are a lot of transfers that go on between the state government and the city of Chicago government. But Illinois is in some dire trouble. And you mentioned there's a wide range of states and the sort of extent of the difficulty that they're in. Where does that come from? I mean, some of it comes from just differences in how cautious states have been or how much they've set aside to try to to fund these pensions. They're all playing by these flawed economic accounting rules, but some of them have sort of interpreted them even more loosely than others. Illinois is a place where they have a separate sort of law on the books that says that they're allowed to they have to contribute something, but that's what that something is even less than what my sort of $50,000 vacation example would allow you to do. I mean, so for them, they've satisfied the law if maybe they only are contributing $30,000 or $35,000. So they're in deep trouble. And the other thing that puts them in deep trouble is that even sort of small adjustments to the pension promise itself cannot be made in Illinois. They have a constitutional rule that says that these pensions are ironclad. It's interesting to kind of compare it to, if you think about what happened in the Detroit bankruptcy. Detroit is the city went through a bankruptcy starting in about 2013. And Michigan was also a state where these pensions were highly protected. At the end of the day, you'll read some stories that as a result of the city's bankruptcy, some of the pensions were reduced by something, maybe up to 4 or 5%. But people who had loaned money to the city or creditors, they lost everything. So the pensions really have a certain priority. They're a promise. Maybe it should be that way because they're promises sort of to people who are working for the state. But those rules make it very, very hard to do anything about the fact that the pensions have to be paid.
Thank you. I have one final question before asking the true final question. If you were able to force pension reforms in your state, what would those reforms look like?
Well, I think the first big rule is, stop digging the hole deeper. So, and what that means is let's just start with something really basic, which is that new hires to government employment should be on a different type of plan. They should be on a plan that is more like a private sector 401k plan. But I hesitate even to compare it to that because it would be something that you could give a pretty generous plan like that with, say, a 10% of pay contribution by the government or even a 15% of pay contribution by the government to someone. And still, it would be fiscally much, much, much better than bringing them into the defined benefit plan system. The defined benefit plan system is really like a Ponzi scheme. So I would say, a good new 401k type plan for new hires in the California public employment, and by good I mean with a good high employer contribution rate. And I'll note that these defined benefit plans, they've also, while they're great for people who are going to work for the city or the state for 30 or 40 years, then you do really well. The labor market has changed. Not everybody wants to work for the same employer for 30 or 40 years. And wouldn't it be nice if we could have people who could be teachers and work for, say, 5 years or 10 years and still walk away with a decent amount of money in a retirement account? In many places, if you do that, if you do that now, you basically walk away with nothing, with no retirement account. Because you didn't really accumulate very many rights to a pension. You got to get that. You got to be working for the state or the city for 20 or 30 or 40 years. So I think that would be the number one thing. And if we did that, and maybe we could find a way to implement a sort of hybrid model for existing employees, we could probably spread the kind of legacy problem out over a very long period of time and fix a lot of what ails us.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this and I've learned so much. Before we close, I want to ask you, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you changed your position on and why?
I would say one of the things that I've really changed my position on is the idea that the labor movement is really operating fundamentally in the broad interests of its members. And I guess part of this is because of studying pensions and public employees for a very long time. It seems that a lot of the pushback against trying new things to fix the pension problem does come from public sector labor unions. And I actually don't think they're operating in the interest of their members more broadly, because they're continuing to require basically their members new members to join a Ponzi scheme, effectively, to join a pyramid scheme. And it's not good for them. It's not good for people who might want to move around from one employer to another, from one state to another. And it's not good for society. And so I think, I haven't studied labor unions in the private sector as much. They're much smaller today. Labor unions in the public sector really are not operating in the interests of their members or of society at large. And there's been a lot on teachers unions as well. But that's something that I've come to over a period of time from studying these issues.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.